My father called me the biggest disappointment in front of 50 relatives. I smiled while my arrogant brother smirked at me, thinking that he had finally won, slid a brown folder next to his glass, and walked out. When he opened it, his jaw dropped. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 35 years old, and according to my family, I was the one child who never truly belonged. It happened during our annual Family Day gathering. Nearly 50 relatives filled the old walnut orchard where I grew up. Kids chased each other between the trees while uncles worked the grill and aunts caught up on everyone's lives. From a distance, we looked like the perfect family. The moment I stepped out of my car, I heard the whispers. Claire actually came? I thought she'd skip it again. She's probably too busy with work. I smiled, greeted a few relatives, hugged an aunt I hadn't seen in years, and kept walking. Everyone was polite, but there was always that awkward pause after they asked how I was doing. It was like nobody knew how to talk to the daughter who had slowly disappeared from family gatherings. Then I saw Ethan. My older brother stood beside my father like he already owned the orchard. People kept asking for his opinion about the harvest, equipment, even local business. Every conversation somehow ended with laughter. He noticed me and walked over. I wasn't sure you'd remember how to get here, he said. I almost didn't, he chuckled. Nice to know family finally made your schedule. I never said family wasn't important. No, he replied. You just have an interesting way of showing it. Before I could answer, another cousin called his name. I'll catch up with you later. He never did. That was Ethan. Always surrounded by people, always admired, always exactly where everyone expected the perfect son to be. A few minutes later, my father walked over. For a second, I thought maybe he'd hug me. Instead, he simply nodded. Glad you made it. No smile, no, how have you been? Nothing else. Someone called him from across the yard, and he left before our conversation had even started. I picked up a glass of lemonade and watched everyone else laugh together. I shouldn't have expected anything different. Lunch started soon after. Kids laughed over spilled drinks, my cousins argued about football, and my aunt insisted everyone take another slice of pie. For a few minutes, I almost believed the afternoon might stay peaceful. Then my father stood and tapped his glass. The conversations faded. I just want to say how proud I am of this family. He praised my sister for growing her business, congratulated one cousin on a promotion. Then he smiled proudly at Ethan. And none of this orchard would still be standing without Ethan's leadership. Everyone applauded. Then his eyes landed on me. But families aren't built by people who only care about numbers. The applause stopped. My biggest disappointment has always been the child who chose spreadsheets over people. Nobody spoke. Several relatives looked down at their plates. Someone quietly cleared their throat. Ethan wasn't laughing. He simply gave me that small, satisfied smirk that said he thought he'd finally won. I didn't argue. There wasn't any point. I reached into my bag, pulled out a brown folder, and walked over to my father. Across the front were 2 words. For Dad. He frowned. What's this? Everything you need to know. Claire, I hope you read every page. Then I turned around and walked away. No one stopped me. Not my father. Not Ethan. Not anyone. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking hard enough that I had to grip the steering wheel before starting the engine. The strange part was, that wasn't how my day had begun. At 8:30 that morning, I was in my office in Maple Ridge helping one of my clients, Harold Mason, untangle a tax audit he thought would cost him his apple farm. I've barely slept, he admitted, sliding a stack of notices across my desk. I read through them, circled a few numbers, and looked up. It looks intimidating, I said, but it's fixable. For the next hour, we sorted through missing records and old tax filings. When we finished, Harold finally smiled. I walked in thinking I'd lose everything. And now? I think I'll actually sleep tonight. After he left, the office became quiet. I looked at the clock. Family day. I could stay, finish another report, and nobody would be surprised if I never showed up. Then my phone buzzed. It wasn't a text, just a reminder I'd written to myself weeks earlier. Don't forget what Mom asked. I quietly opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was an old wooden box. The wooden box had been sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk for almost 2 years. I carefully lifted it out and brushed my thumb across the worn lid. The scratches on the wood were familiar. My mom used to keep family recipes in it before she became too sick to cook. After she passed away, it somehow ended up with me. I stared at it for a few seconds before placing it on the passenger seat. "Guess I'm really doing this," I whispered. The drive from Maple Ridge to the orchard took a little over an hour. The closer I got, the more familiar everything looked. The old gas station where Dad used to buy us ice cream after school. The church where my parents renewed their vows on their 25th anniversary. Even the narrow country road lined with walnut trees hadn't changed much. Everything looked the same. Only the people waiting for me had changed. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, the place was already full. Cars filled both sides of the entrance, children were running across the grass, and someone had country music playing through a speaker that was just a little too loud. I took one deep breath before getting out. My Aunt Diane spotted me first. "Well, look who finally decided to come." She smiled as she hugged me, but it felt more polite than warm. "It's good to see you, Aunt Diane. We were starting to think your calendar didn't have room for family anymore." "I've been busy. Haven't we all?" She gave my shoulder a light pat before turning to greet someone else. That was the entire conversation. I hadn't even been there a minute. A few cousins came over next. Some genuinely looked happy to see me. Others seemed unsure whether we should hug or just shake hands. "So, you're still doing finance?" one cousin asked. "I am." "Must pay pretty well." "It keeps me busy." He nodded, then glanced toward Ethan. "I've actually been meaning to ask him something." And just like that, he walked away. I couldn't even blame him. Every few minutes, another relative drifted toward Ethan. Someone wanted advice about replacing farm equipment. Another wanted help negotiating with a supplier. A neighbor thanked him for organizing the last harvest. He answered every question like he'd been doing it forever. Confident, comfortable, like this was exactly where he belonged. Watching everyone gather around him brought back memories I hadn't thought about in years. When Mom was alive, she had a way of making every voice matter. Dad handled the business, Mom handled the people. Nobody competed for attention because she never let anyone feel invisible. After she was gone, things slowly changed. Nobody announced it. It just happened. Family decisions started revolving around Ethan. People stopped asking what I thought. Then they stopped expecting me to come at all. "Claire," I turned and saw Mr. Collins, one of our old neighbors. "I heard you're some kind of financial expert now." I laughed. "I don't know about expert. My son says you helped save his friend's business. I just helped him understand his numbers." "Well," he smiled, "that's more than most people can do." Before I could answer, Ethan walked over and clapped Mr. Collins on the shoulder. "Ready to look at that irrigation problem after lunch?" "Absolutely." The conversation instantly shifted. I quietly stepped back. Nobody noticed. It wasn't cruel, it was almost worse than that. It felt normal. As if everyone had accepted that Ethan belonged in the middle of every conversation, while I naturally faded into the background. I wandered toward the edge of the orchard where the oldest walnut trees still stood. One of them had a small carved heart from when my sister and I were kids. Mom pretended she was angry when she found it. Dad actually was. Mom laughed anyway. For the first time since arriving, I smiled without forcing it. Your mother loved that tree. I turned. Dad was standing a few feet away. I know. He looked at the branches instead of me. She would have been happy everyone came today. I think so too. The conversation stalled. Neither of us seemed to know what came next. Finally, he cleared his throat. We should get back. He started walking before I answered. As we crossed the yard, I noticed someone from a local development company waiting near one of the picnic tables. Dad greeted the man briefly, but Ethan stepped in almost immediately. The three of them spoke quietly while everyone else stayed busy eating and talking. A minute later, Dad reached into a leather folder, pulled out several documents, and handed them to Ethan without reading a single page. Ethan accepted them without hesitation. Then he slipped the papers under his arm and smiled like everything was exactly the way he wanted it. Dad handing those papers to Ethan without reading them brought back a memory I hadn't thought about in years. It started 6 years earlier, when my mom was still alive, but already too weak to spend much time outside. Back then, the orchard wasn't doing well. A late frost had damaged part of the harvest, operating costs kept climbing, and buyers were offering less than they had the year before. It wasn't a disaster yet, but it was obvious we couldn't keep running things the same way forever. One Saturday afternoon, Dad called everyone into the dining room. Ethan spread several pages across the table. I've been talking to a company that builds modern processing facilities, he said. If we stop selling raw walnuts and process them ourselves, we'll make a lot more money. Dad leaned forward immediately. How much more? Enough to change everything. I looked over the proposal. The numbers caught my attention before anything else. Where's the financing coming from? I asked. A business loan. How big? Ethan named the amount. The room went quiet. It was much larger than I expected. Dad looked impressed. I looked worried. I read through the projections again. They're assuming perfect harvests for several years, I said. That's optimistic. Ethan folded his arms. Businesses grow by taking risks. They grow by managing risks. He smiled like I'd completely missed the point. You always see problems first. Because that's literally my job. Dad sighed. Claire, I'm serious. I turned another page. If walnut prices fall or interest rates increase, the cash flow won't support these payments. We'll adjust. With what money? Ethan leaned back in his chair. You always make everything sound impossible. No, I'm saying we should slow down and stress test the numbers before signing anything. Dad shook his head. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts. I trust math. You trust spreadsheets. His voice wasn't angry. That almost made it worse. We can't build a future if we're afraid of every opportunity. I'm not afraid, I said quietly. I'm trying to keep us from making a mistake we can't afford. Nobody answered. Mom had been listening from the living room. She slowly walked into the doorway, holding onto the wall for balance. I think Claire's only asking you to be careful. Dad gave her a reassuring smile. We are being careful. Ethan nodded. I've already talked to lenders. They believe in this project. I wanted to ask whether the lenders believed in the project, or simply believed we'd repay the loan. But I looked at my mom. She looked exhausted. This wasn't the moment to start another argument. I've said what I needed to say, I told them. Dad reached across the table and patted Ethan on the shoulder. I'm proud of you for thinking bigger than the last generation. That sentence stayed with me, not because he praised Ethan, because it felt like he'd already decided whose judgment mattered. The loan was approved a few weeks later. Construction started almost immediately. Whenever I visited, there were new trucks, new equipment, and more contractors walking around the orchard. Everyone seemed excited. Relatives talked about the expansion like success was already guaranteed. Whenever I brought up budgets or repayment schedules, someone found a way to change the subject. Eventually, I stopped offering advice unless someone asked. Almost nobody did. Mom still called me every few days. "Your father means well," she'd say. "I know. And Ethan isn't trying to hurt anyone." "I know that too." "Then don't give up on them." "I won't." She stayed quiet for a second. "Promise me." "I promise." A few months passed. Mom's health became worse. Between hospital visits and work, I wasn't at the orchard very often. One afternoon, I stopped by the house while Dad was out meeting a supplier. I was looking for one of Mom's insurance papers. Instead, I opened the wrong kitchen drawer. Inside wasn't a recipe book or old bills. It was a thick stack of unopened envelopes from the bank. I pulled one envelope out of the drawer and looked at the return address. The bank. Another one. The bank again. There were at least 8 envelopes, all stamped with dates from different weeks. Some had already been opened. Others were still sealed. I unfolded the first letter. Past due. The second one mentioned missed payments. The third warned that the account was in default unless immediate action was taken. I felt my stomach tighten. These weren't ordinary reminders. They were the kind of letters people tried very hard not to receive. I quickly checked the loan number. It matched the financing Ethan had convinced Dad to take. I heard the front door open. Without thinking, I slid everything back into the drawer. Dad walked into the kitchen carrying 2 grocery bags. "Oh," he said with a smile. "I didn't know you were stopping by." "I came to grab Mom's insurance paperwork." He nodded. "Did you find it?" "Not yet." He set the bags on the counter and started putting things away like it was any normal afternoon. I watched him for a few seconds before speaking. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "I found some letters from the bank." His hand stopped moving. Only for a second. Then he picked up another can and placed it in the cabinet. "They're nothing to worry about." "They don't look like nothing. They're routine." "Dad, they're talking about missed payments." He let out a slow breath. "Ethan's handling it." I stepped closer. "Have you actually looked at them?" "I don't need to." "Why not?" "Because I trust my son." The words stung more than I expected. "I'm your daughter too." He looked at me for the first time since we'd started talking. "I didn't mean it that way." "Then what did you mean?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Claire, your brother understands what's happening. So do I. You understand numbers. I understand debt. That's exactly what I mean." I stared at him. "I do this for a living." "I know." "No, I don't think you do." My voice stayed calm, but it was getting harder to keep it there. If these notices are accurate, the orchard is carrying more pressure than it should. Dad shook his head. "You're making assumptions." "I'm reading the bank's own letters." "Ethan already explained everything." "Did he?" Dad's expression changed. Not angry, just tired. "I've got enough going on with your mother." The room became quiet. He wasn't wrong. Mom's treatments were taking everything out of him. Doctor appointments, hospital bills, sleepless nights. I understood why he wanted someone else to carry part of the burden. I just wasn't sure Ethan was carrying it in the right direction. "I'm not trying to criticize him," I said more softly. "I know. I just don't want you blindsided." He closed the cabinet door. "I appreciate the concern." It sounded polite. Final. The conversation was over. A few minutes later, Ethan pulled into the driveway. He walked inside carrying blueprints under one arm. "Hey," he said casually. "I didn't know you were here." "I was just leaving." Dad looked relieved to see him. Claire had questions about the loan. Ethan barely hesitated. "It's under control." I looked directly at him. "Can you show me the updated cash flow?" He smiled. "You don't have to audit everything." "I'm not auditing. I'm managing the project. And I'm asking a simple question." He shrugged. We're busy right now. Dad stepped between us without making it obvious. Let's not do this today. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. But nobody answered my question either. I drove home with more questions than I'd arrived with. The numbers from those letters stayed in my head the entire way. Something wasn't adding up. Not the payment schedule, not Ethan's confidence, not Dad's refusal to even read the notices himself. When I got back to my apartment, I set my keys on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long moment. Then I walked to my bedroom closet. On the top shelf sat the same old wooden box I'd kept since Mom passed away. I carried it to the table and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, folded exactly the way she'd left it, was the last letter my mother had ever written to me. I unfolded Mom's letter as carefully as if it might fall apart in my hands. I'd read it dozens of times, but every time I reached the first sentence, it felt like she was sitting across from me. Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to keep everyone together. I smiled without meaning to. That sounded exactly like her. She spent her whole life making peace between people who were too stubborn to admit they needed each other. The letter wasn't long. She didn't mention the orchard. She didn't talk about money. She never asked me to protect the family business. Instead, she wrote about people. Your father will pretend he's stronger than he is. Ethan will try to carry more than he should. Don't let pride become the thing that tears this family apart. Near the end, one sentence had always stayed with me. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to protect the people you love. I folded the letter and placed it back inside the box. I wished following her advice were that simple. Over the next few months, Mom's condition became worse. Most of my free time disappeared into hospital visits, insurance calls, and meetings with specialists. The bills kept growing. Every visit seemed to cost more than the last. One afternoon, I overheard Dad arguing quietly with someone from the billing office. I just need a little more time. His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. He didn't know I was standing around the corner. I quietly stepped away before he saw me. That night, I called the hospital's financial department myself. I'd like to make a payment, I told them. They asked for my name. I hesitated. Can it be processed anonymously? The woman on the phone paused. It can. Then don't tell the family where it came from. I started doing that whenever I could. Some months it was a small payment. Other months it was almost everything I had left after paying my own bills. No one ever thanked me. They couldn't. No one knew. At first I told myself I'd explain someday. Then I realized it wasn't about getting credit. It was about making sure Mom received the care she needed. While all of that was happening, Ethan kept insisting the expansion project only needed more time. There are always delays, he'd tell Dad. The first year is the hardest. Dad believed him. I wanted to. But the numbers told a different story. Equipment costs had gone up. Revenue wasn't matching the projections. Loan payments were getting harder to meet. I built my own spreadsheet using every piece of information I could gather. No matter how I adjusted the numbers, the result stayed the same. The orchard was heading toward a serious cash flow problem. A few weeks after Mom's funeral, the family gathered at the house to discuss what came next. I thought everyone would finally have an honest conversation. Instead, the room filled with excuses. We've just had bad luck. The market will recover. We can't panic. Then Aunt Diane looked at me. Maybe if Claire had spent more time here instead of hiding behind an office desk, things would have been easier. Several people nodded. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Ethan didn't defend me, neither did Dad. He simply stared at the table. I wanted to remind them I'd spent countless evenings at the hospital, that I'd been helping pay for treatments they didn't even know about. Instead, I stayed quiet. Nothing I said would have changed their minds. As everyone began leaving, my cousin Mark caught up with me outside. I'm sorry about what Aunt Diane said. It's fine. No, It wasn't. He hesitated before adding, "People think you've moved on from the family. I haven't. It doesn't always look that way." I nodded. "I know." Driving home that evening, I stopped at a red light and found myself doing what I always did when something didn't make sense. I started adding up numbers in my head. Loan payments, hospital costs, operating expenses, the orchard's shrinking income. None of it worked. Not anymore. For the first time, I stopped asking whether the orchard was in trouble. I started asking how much time it had left. The answer scared me. If someone didn't step in soon, the bank wasn't going to wait forever. I called Samuel Pierce the moment I got back to my office. He'd been our family's attorney for as long as I could remember. When I was a kid, he handled property paperwork for my parents. He even came to our house for Thanksgiving a few times. He sounded surprised to hear from me. "Claire, it's been a while." "It has? What can I do for you?" "I need 30 minutes, maybe an hour." His tone changed. "That serious?" "I'm afraid it is." He told me to come by that afternoon. His office hadn't changed much over the years. Same old bookshelves. Same coffee that somehow always tasted too strong. Samuel looked at me for a moment before speaking. "You look tired." "I've had a rough few months." I figured. He waited until I sat down. "So, tell me what's going on." I explained everything. The expansion loan, the missed payments, the letters I'd found, the conversations that kept ending with, "Ethan's handling it." Samuel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "How much do you actually know about the loan?" "Enough to know they're running out of room." He nodded slowly. "I checked the public filings a few weeks ago. That caught my attention." "You did?" I was curious. "And?" He folded his hands together. "The original bank no longer owns the debt." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "They sold it." "To a collection company?" "Not exactly. An investment group purchased the loan." I stared at him. "So whoever owns that debt now controls what happens next." "Within the limits of the law, yes." I already knew banks sold loans sometimes. I'd seen it happen with commercial clients. I just never imagined it happening to my own family. "How long do they have?" I asked. Samuel sighed. "Not forever. If payments don't improve, they'll eventually begin foreclosure proceedings." The room went quiet. I looked down at the documents he'd placed on the desk. Every page confirmed what I'd already feared. The orchard wasn't approaching the edge, it was already standing on it. "There has to be another option." Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another file drawer and pulled out a different folder. "There is one." He slid it toward me. "If the current debt holder is willing to sell, someone else can purchase the loan before foreclosure moves forward." I looked up. "You mean refinance it?" "No." "Then what?" "Buy the debt itself." I blinked. I've never heard of families doing that. Most families can't. My mind started working before I even realized it. If someone owned the debt, they controlled the lien, which meant they controlled the timeline. The orchard could be protected without Dad or Ethan even realizing how close they'd come to losing it. Samuel watched my expression carefully. "I know that look." "What look?" "The one where you've already started doing the math." I couldn't help smiling. "I probably have." He smiled back, but only for a second. "Claire, before you let your heart make this decision, let your accountant make it first." "I know. This won't be cheap." "I know." "You could lose years of savings." "I know." His voice softened. "They've treated you unfairly." I looked out the window. The easiest thing would have been walking away. No more arguments. No more trying to convince people who didn't want to listen. I could let the consequences play out exactly the way they'd chosen. No one could blame me, not honestly. Then I thought about my mom, about the promise I'd made beside her hospital bed. Don't give up on them. I let out a long breath. If I don't help, Samuel finished the sentence for me. There's a very good chance the orchard won't survive. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I looked back at him. If I decide to do this, what? I don't want anyone knowing. He raised an eyebrow. Not Dad. Not Ethan. Nobody. You understand they may never realize what you've done. I didn't ask whether they'd appreciate it. I asked whether it could be done. Samuel held my gaze for a long moment. Then he slowly nodded. It can. I picked up the folder and held it in both hands. Everything I'd worked for over the past decade suddenly had a price attached to it. And I already knew exactly how I was going to pay it. The next few weeks became a blur of meetings, paperwork, and numbers that were suddenly very personal. Selling investments for clients had always been easy. Selling my own was different. I liquidated a retirement account I'd promised myself I'd never touch. Then I sold most of the investment portfolio I'd spent years building, one careful decision at a time. Every transaction felt like I was giving away a piece of the future I'd worked so hard to create. Samuel never tried to talk me out of it. He simply made sure I understood every document before I signed. You still have time to walk away, he reminded me one afternoon. I looked at the papers in front of me. If I walk away, they'll lose the orchard. Possibly. And if I stay, you'll probably lose most of your savings. I picked up the pen. I can earn money again. He nodded slowly. Land that's been in a family for 3 generations is harder to replace. That was all I needed to hear. The legal process took longer than I expected. Samuel suggested creating a small family trust instead of putting everything directly under my name. It gives the property another layer of protection, he explained. And fewer questions? He smiled. That too. A few signatures later, it was done. The investment group transferred the debt. The primary lien on the orchard now belonged to the trust. Legally, everything had changed. In everyday life, nothing had. Dad never called. Ethan never asked where the money had come from or why the foreclosure process suddenly slowed down. As far as they knew, they were simply buying themselves more time. I let them believe it. Life settled into a routine again. I spent my weekdays meeting clients, reviewing financial plans, and helping small business owners solve problems that felt strangely simple compared to my own. Every now and then, I'd drive past the orchard on my way to another appointment. Construction had slowed. Some equipment sat untouched for days. Workers came less often than they used to. The warning signs were still there. They just weren't obvious to people who didn't know where to look. One Saturday, my cousin Mark called. Haven't seen you in a while. I've been working. I figured. He hesitated. You know, Dad and Ethan keep saying the orchard's finally turning around. I hope they're right. You don't sound convinced. I hope they're right, I repeated. He laughed softly. You always answer questions like an accountant. Occupational hazard. Before hanging up, he said something that stayed with me. People still think you gave up on the family. I looked out the office window. I know. They don't see everything. They're not supposed to. Sometimes staying silent was easier than explaining the truth. Sometimes it was lonelier. Months turned into years. Business grew. I hired an assistant, moved into a larger office. From the outside, my life looked successful. Inside, there was always one part of it I couldn't completely leave behind. Every annual financial review included one file that no client ever saw: the orchard. I'd open it, confirm the payments were current, check the legal records, then quietly close it again. No one knew I was still watching. No one knew I was still protecting the place. Not because I expected anyone to thank me, because I'd made a promise. That promise eventually brought me back to Family Day. Standing in the middle of the crowd, I tried to convince myself this visit was only about keeping my word to Mom. Then something caught my attention. Across the yard, Ethan glanced around to make sure no one was paying attention. He rested a hand on Dad's shoulder and quietly guided him away from the picnic tables. Not toward the house. Toward a man in a dark suit I didn't recognize. Dad was carrying a leather folder. Ethan reached for it before either of them disappeared behind the equipment shed. I stayed where I was and pretended to be interested in a conversation about this year's harvest. From the corner of my eye, I watched Ethan. The man in the suit shook Dad's hand, spoke for less than a minute, then walked away toward a black SUV parked near the road. When Ethan and Dad came back, neither of them mentioned him. Nobody else seemed to notice he'd even been there. I almost asked. Instead, I kept quiet. Sometimes people reveal more when they think no one is paying attention. Lunch was served outside under a row of old walnut trees. Kids ran through the grass while the adults filled paper plates and talked about weather, sports, and rising grocery prices. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Even Aunt Diane managed to avoid criticizing anyone. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and immediately stood up. "I'll be right back." He walked far enough away that no one could hear him. When he returned, he looked relaxed, but he checked his watch twice within the next few minutes. That wasn't like him. Ethan loved being the center of every conversation. Today, his attention kept drifting somewhere else. Dad noticed it too. "You expecting somebody?" "Just handling business." "Today?" "It'll only take a minute." Dad nodded without asking another question. That bothered me more than it should have. Years ago, Dad questioned everything I suggested. Now Ethan barely had to explain himself. As the afternoon went on, I spotted two more people I didn't recognize. Neither looked like neighbors. Neither joined the party. They spoke with Ethan near the equipment barn, handed him a few papers, then left. I wandered closer under the excuse of grabbing another drink. The conversation ended before I got within earshot. Ethan smiled when he saw me. "Enjoying yourself?" "I'm trying." "Good." He folded several papers and slipped them into a leather folder. "What are those?" "Nothing interesting." "You've been saying that a lot today." He laughed. "Not everything is a financial mystery, Claire." "No. But you usually act differently when something actually isn't important." His smile faded for half a second. Then it came back. "I think you've been watching too many crime shows." "Maybe. Or maybe I'd spent too many years watching clients hide problems until they became impossible to fix." As the afternoon stretched on, Dad started telling old family stories. Everyone gathered around except Ethan. He remained distracted, checking his phone every few minutes. Finally, he interrupted. "Dad, can I borrow you for a second?" "What for?" "Just a couple signatures." Dad stood without hesitation. "What am I signing?" "Routine paperwork." "For what?" "Nothing exciting." Dad chuckled. "If you say so." I watched them walk toward the porch. A few minutes later, I quietly drifted closer. The front door was partly open. I couldn't hear every word, only pieces. "Deadline? Before the end of the week?" "Everyone's already agreed." Then Ethan's voice became clearer. "Just sign here." Dad barely looked at the pages. He reached for the pen. My chest tightened. I took one step forward, then stopped. I had no proof anything was wrong, only instincts. And instincts weren't enough to accuse my own brother in front of 50 relatives. Dad signed something. Ethan immediately closed the folder. That happened too fast. Much too fast. The rest of the afternoon felt different. Every laugh sounded forced. Every smile from Ethan seemed carefully placed. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside that folder mattered far more than anyone realized. Dinner finally brought everyone back inside the house. The kitchen became crowded. People carried bowls from one room to another while cousins argued over dessert, and kids chased each other through the hallway. In the middle of all that noise, Ethan's phone rang again. He answered it immediately. "I'll be outside." He hurried through the back door without finishing his sentence. A moment later, Dad followed Aunt Diane into the dining room. For the first time all day, the leather folder wasn't in Ethan's hand anymore. It was sitting by itself on the kitchen counter. No one else seemed to notice it. The folder sat exactly where Ethan had left it. People moved in and out of the kitchen carrying plates, laughing over old stories, arguing about who made the better pie. No one was paying attention to me. I walked to the counter, picked up the folder, and carried it into my mom's old sewing room. It was the closest room with a door. I didn't lock it. I just closed it enough to keep the noise outside. For a second, I stared at the folder in my hands. I hated what I was about to do. Reading someone else's documents wasn't something I normally justified, but if Dad had been signing paperwork he hadn't read, I needed to know what it was. I opened the folder. The first few pages looked harmless. Property descriptions, survey maps, a development proposal. Then I reached the purchase agreement. My eyes stopped on the number. "No," I whispered it without realizing. The offer wasn't just low, it was unbelievably low. I read it again, then a third time. The land alone was worth significantly more than that. The walnut orchard had been in our family for 3 generations. Even without future income, the property value should have been much higher. Nobody with basic experience in real estate would accept that price. Unless... I kept reading. The buyer wasn't a local farming company. It was a development corporation from another city. Their plan wasn't to improve the orchard. They intended to redevelop most of the property. The more pages I turned, the worse it became. Buried halfway through the contract was another document. A limited power of attorney. Dad had authorized Ethan to negotiate the sale. Limited, not unlimited. There were still restrictions. I kept looking. Payment schedule, transfer conditions, closing timeline. Everything had been prepared as if the deal was already guaranteed. Footsteps passed outside the room. I stayed perfectly still until they disappeared. Then I turned another page. Attached behind the contract was a financial statement. It wasn't for the orchard. It was for Ethan. I recognized the format immediately. Personal liabilities, several overdue business loans, credit obligations, private debt that had nothing to do with the family farm. I felt my pulse speed up. The dates lined up almost perfectly. The expansion project had failed. Then Ethan's own businesses started losing money. Now this. He wasn't selling part of the orchard to rescue the family. He was trying to rescue himself. Every piece suddenly fit together. The secret meetings, the phone calls, the strangers, the pressure on Dad to sign quickly. The low selling price made sense now. A fast buyer. A fast closing, quick cash. He didn't need the best offer. He needed the fastest one. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a second. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted there to be some explanation I hadn't considered. There wasn't. I heard voices in the hallway. "Has anyone seen Ethan's folder?" Someone answered. "No idea." I carefully returned every page to its original position. Before closing it, one final detail caught my attention: the legal description of the property. Out of habit, I checked the section listing existing liens. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Then they stopped. The buyer's attorney had listed the orchard as if the original lender still held the primary security interest. That wasn't true anymore. Not for the past 2 years. I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because Ethan had built his entire plan on information that was already outdated. He had absolutely no idea who now controlled the primary lien on the property, which meant he had no idea who actually had the legal authority to stop this sale. I closed the folder gently. Outside, I could hear Ethan walking back toward the kitchen. He still sounded confident. He still believed everything was under control. He had no idea. The one person standing between him and that signed contract was already inside the house. I put Ethan's folder back exactly where I'd found it. A minute later, he walked into the kitchen, picked it up without even checking inside, and headed back outside. He never realized anyone had opened it. I stayed through the rest of dinner, but I barely heard a single conversation. The only thing running through my mind was one question. Did I actually need to do anything? Legally, maybe not. If Ethan kept moving forward with that contract, the closing would eventually hit a wall. The buyer's attorneys would discover the primary lien wasn't where they thought it was. The sale couldn't be completed without the trust's approval. My approval. The deal would collapse on its own. Ethan would have to explain everything. Part of me thought that was exactly what he deserved. The next morning, I drove straight to Samuel's office. He looked at my face and skipped the small talk. What happened? I handed him a copy of the purchase agreement I'd photographed. He read quietly for several minutes. Finally, he looked up. So you know. I know enough. He tapped the contract with one finger. They can't close this transaction. Because of the trust? He nodded. The primary security interest was transferred 2 years ago. So nothing has changed? Nothing. What if Ethan doesn't know? Samuel gave me a tired smile. Judging from this paperwork, he doesn't. I leaned back in the chair. So I could simply wait. You could. And eventually the deal falls apart. Yes. He embarrasses himself. Probably. I looked out the window. For a few seconds, that option sounded perfect. No confrontation, no family argument, no public humiliation caused by me. Just the truth catching up with him. Samuel seemed to know exactly what I was thinking. But that's not why you're here. I smiled faintly. You know me too well. You didn't spend years protecting your family just to watch it explode from a distance. He wasn't wrong. On the drive home, I stopped at a red light and thought about my mom again. Not the hospital, not the funeral. Just ordinary memories. Her watering flowers before breakfast, calling everyone inside for dinner, finding ways to calm people down before small disagreements became permanent ones. She never ignored problems. She faced them. Just gently. That evening, I took the wooden box off my closet shelf one more time. I unfolded her letter. My eyes stopped on the sentence I'd memorized years ago. Don't let pride become the thing that tears this family apart. I sat there for a long time. This wasn't about proving Ethan wrong, or proving I had been right. It wasn't even about the orchard anymore. It was about giving my father the truth before someone else destroyed what little trust our family still had. The decision finally felt clear. The following morning, I met Samuel one last time. I need certified copies. Of everything? Everything. Within an hour, his assistant returned with a neat stack of documents. The trust agreement, the debt transfer, the recorded lien assignment, the payoff confirmation. Every page that explained exactly what had happened over the last 2 years. Samuel placed them in front of me. Once your father sees these, nothing in your family will stay the same. I know. Are you ready for that? I looked down at the papers. No. Then I slipped every document into a plain brown folder. But I'm ready for the truth. By the time I drove back to the orchard, the family day celebration was winding down. People were finishing dessert. Children were chasing each other across the yard. Relatives gathered near the old walnut tree where Dad always gave a short speech before everyone went home. I stood near the back of the crowd with the brown folder resting quietly against my side. Dad picked up his glass with one hand, then he smiled at everyone around him. I just want to say a few words before we all head home. Dad cleared his throat and lifted his glass. The conversations around the yard slowly faded. This family has been through a lot, he began. But I'm proud that most of my children understand what really matters. He looked toward Ethan and smiled. Then his eyes landed on me. Success isn't just about making money. Sometimes people become so focused on numbers that they forget what family means. A few relatives nodded. Aunt Diane didn't even try to hide her agreement. Dad took a slow breath. My biggest disappointment has always been the child who chose a career over the people who loved her. No one said my name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. Then I looked at Ethan. He wasn't surprised. He wore the same quiet smile he'd had all afternoon, the smile of someone who thought he'd already won. I stood up. No dramatic speech, no shouting, no argument. I walked toward Dad, holding the brown folder against my side. He frowned. What is this? I think you should read it. Now? I'd appreciate it. I placed the folder beside his glass. For you. Then I looked at Ethan. He met my eyes without saying a word. I simply said, all the answers are in there. I turned around and started walking toward my car. Behind me, I heard confused voices. Claire. Dad called my name once. I didn't stop. I opened my car door just as the yard fell completely silent. Curiosity had finally beaten pride. Dad had opened the folder. I couldn't see him anymore, but I could imagine exactly what he was reading. The trust agreement, the debt transfer, the documents proving the orchard had been protected 2 years earlier, the payoff confirmation, then the copies of Ethan's proposed land sale, the purchase agreement, the personal debts, the numbers that connected everything. Someone shouted Ethan's name. Another voice said, "Is this true?" I rested one hand on the roof of my car. For the first time that day, I wasn't trying to predict what everyone else would think. I simply waited. Dad called again. This time, his voice sounded completely different. Claire. Not angry, not disappointed, just stunned. I turned around. He was standing in the middle of the yard with papers shaking in his hands. His face had lost every bit of color. He looked from the documents to Ethan. What did you do? Ethan took one step forward. Dad, let me explain. Explain what? It wasn't supposed to. You tried to sell the orchard? It wasn't like that. It was temporary. It would have solved everything. Dad looked down at another page. No. His voice cracked. She solved everything. Nobody spoke. Aunt Diane quietly lowered her eyes. Mark stared at Ethan without saying a word. Even Ethan's wife took a small step away from him. Dad looked back toward me. You. He struggled to finish the sentence. You paid the debt? I nodded once. A long time ago. Why didn't you tell us? I thought about that for a second. Because I didn't do it to win an argument. The yard stayed silent. There wasn't anything else to add. I got into my car and drove away. I didn't look in the mirror. A few weeks later, Samuel finalized a new ownership structure that made sure no single person could sell the orchard without multiple approvals. Dad called several times before I answered. When we finally met for coffee, he apologized the only way he seemed capable of, not with perfect words, just quietly. I should have listened. I nodded. I know. Some things between us got better. Some things never completely healed. Trust doesn't come back as quickly as paperwork. Ethan and I barely spoke after that. I wasn't interested in punishing him. I just needed distance. Mom had asked me to protect the family if I could. She never asked me to lose myself doing it. Looking back, I don't think the hardest part was being called the biggest disappointment. The hardest part was knowing the truth for years and choosing patience over revenge. Sometimes the people who look the coldest are simply carrying responsibilities no one else can see. And sometimes doing the right thing doesn't earn applause. It just lets you sleep peacefully at night. If this story meant something to you, or you've ever been misunderstood by the people closest to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Feel free to share this story with someone who might relate. And subscribe if you'd like to hear more real family drama stories like this. Thank you for spending your time with me, and wherever you're watching from, I hope you're doing well. I'll see you in the next story.